Welcome to the Your City podcast, where we get to know our neighbors so that we can be good neighbors. I'm your host, Aaron Williams, and today I'm joined by Mike Gillis, who is the Director of Media for the City of Dover. And we're going to talk to him about his responsibilities for his position, how his position serves the community, and what inspired him to take it up. Mike, thank you for coming on to the show.
Thanks, Aaron.
Yeah,
Happy to be here.
Absolutely. So do you have a shout out for the City of Dover ready?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think first and foremost, that for me would be the Woodman Museum, which I know is a place that you've already visited. As a native of the city with a real passion for the city's history, the Woodman Museum has always been one of my favorite places. But more importantly, it's a place that, despite having been here for as long as it has, a lot of people still don't know it's there. And it really is a hidden jewel in this city, and I wish more people knew it was there and took the time to visit.
Awesome. Yeah. When I was talking to Jonathan, he said that he would get people come into the museum. I've lived here, for 30 years and didn't even know about this.
Still to this day, it's amazing how many people don't know that it's there. And there's lots of interesting things at the Woodman Museum, obviously.
Yeah.
Not only local history, as you probably saw, but all kinds of other interesting and some strange things. So.
Yeah. All right. So go check out the Woodman Museum. So, Mike, the Director of Media for an entire city, what does this type of position do? What are some of your responsibilities?
Yeah, it's a question I get a lot. The Director of Media
what is
Services.
It you say you do here?
Yeah, right. Exactly. I mean, because it's not a common title. The Media Services is the department, which is, as of a year ago, is now its own department. It used to be sort of under information technology, but is now its own department. So usually what I tell people first when they ask, what is media services first, think about public information. So some communities have public information officers or communications directors. That's what media services does. So we oversee essentially all of the city's external and in some cases internal communications. So that includes our 2 TV channels, that includes our website, that includes our social media, that includes media relations. So we generate all the press releases that go out to the media. That includes any kind of print material, anything that essentially is communicating to the public what its government is doing funnels through this department. So as the Director of Media Services, I kind of oversee that with a small staff, but that's what our responsibility is.
So you're a part of the transparency initiative that Chris was talking to me about. Okay. How do you guys qualify, like, this needs to be talked about, this needs to be public info, or no, this is city security, what they say, national security risk.
Right.
This is city security risk. How do you distinguish between what needs to be public and what doesn't?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because our position here in the city is that by default, we are transparent. So most things are public. And what I think you'll find, and we have groups from all over the world actually who come visit us through the Department of State to talk about transparency in local government because we're considered to be an example of a government that is doing it the right way. So by default, almost everything that we do is available to the public. It does present a little bit of a problem because it's an enormous amount of information that we make available to the public via the website, video, you name it. So sometimes it's difficult for people to find what they're looking for. But to answer your question about what is or how we decide what is public and what isn't, it really is more of a matter of figuring out what the public would either want to know or needs to know about an initiative or information that is important to them, that is important to their daily lives. We just, for instance, adopted the budget, the fiscal year 2024 budget. It's a months-long process. There's an enormous amount of information, and it's a hard thing to get people engaged in sometimes, even though you're talking about $180+ million budget. It's the single biggest decision that the city council makes, and there's just an enormous amount of information. So we try a number of different ways to reach the public, to engage the public, to get them involved in the process of helping adopt the budget. So there are issues like that, which are sort of the big issues, and then there are a lot of other smaller issues that we know the public needs to be informed about. That we will generate information about PSAs and other. We distribute a weekly newsletter to about 20,000 people. Dover Download, and that includes a lot of information every week about not only what's happening in the coming week, which would include meetings or other issues that are maybe before the city council, but lots of things about did you know, for instance, things like, did you know that the city has composting available at its recycling center on Mass Road, things that people may not know about, but, should be informed about. The other way that we gauge that sometimes is we will hear from people, whether it's the public or other people saying, hey, can you tell me a little bit more about this? And if we know that it's something people are interested in or need more information about, then we will look for ways to get more of that information out to the public so that they can stay informed. We obviously pay attention to social media as much as we can. We use social media to recognizing that is another way to get information out to a certain segment of the population, some of whom really only get their information from social media. It can be a challenge because a lot of the information that is on social media is opinion. It's not necessarily fact. So, we can certainly gauge some of the things that we see on social media and recognize if there's an issue perhaps that bubbles up. And although we wouldn't necessarily just respond directly on social media, we can, on our social media presence, respond in a different way by releasing information or maybe helping clarify an issue that people there might be some misinformation floating around about. So, but that can be a bit of a challenge in the wild, wild world of social media.
Yeah.
So
Social media in general, it seems like it's so easy to communicate back and forth that sometimes the quality, and I'm not trying to target any specific person. It happens with the easier something is to do, the less you have to care about doing it, right? Yeah. And so that can lower the quality of some of the feedback and some of the discourse on there. And that's just a challenge of social media of when everyone has a microphone that's as loud as everybody else.
I think it's important, though, that people do have that opportunity. Coming from a background in journalism, I think it's important that everybody has a voice and is able to share that. And I think social media has done some important things in helping to democratize the way that we share information. I think that's great, and that plays an important role in society. It's how it can be manipulated and distort the reality, I suppose.
Yeah.
And some people are looking for specific things on social media to maybe validate an opinion that they have or want to, be convinced no matter what that what they're saying or thinking is right, even though it may not be right. It may just be a different opinion.
Yeah.
So it's hard as a municipality, as a governmental organization, where we share information and we don't take a position. We're not biased in either way, where people can then take that information and sort of, parse it however they choose.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about that for a moment. How do you mitigate bias? Because one of the examples that I've given previously on the show is if you have a stack of papers, it's already biased because something is on top and something is on bottom. Just the nature of observation by itself presents bias. So it's very difficult to overcome that. What's y'all's approach to minimizing that and trying your best to kind of hey, this is just information, make of it what you will, no tone, no added opinion on top of it. How do y'all minimize that?
Yeah, I think for me, that's maybe a little easier than it is for some. And that's because that's what I did for years as a
Hmm.
journalist, is taking information and sharing it without bias and without forming an opinion. Um, my only other full-time employee in this department is also a former journalist, um, and functions in much the same way. Everything that we assess and prepare and distribute is done in the same way that we would an impartial news story. So we follow the same work ethic that we did as journalists here. And I think it's really important that we do that because and not every community does this. It's it's important for us to be sharing information that has no particular bent one way or another,
Hmm.
because it really should be informational
Yeah.
more than anything.
Hmm.
Um, So sometimes, information that we share may not be the prettiest information. It doesn't necessarily, and it may not show the city in the most flattering light sometimes, but it's important that we're able to still, so that people can make informed decisions on their own. They have the information they need to make those decisions. And if we were to exclude information that maybe isn't as pretty as some of the other information,
At
uh,
that point, you're creating bias.
we are creating bias.
Yeah.
So that has been sort of my edict all along. I was a department of one for the first several years I was here, so that was easy to manage because I was just managing myself.
Yeah.
But now with a staff, we have a very small staff, but we all operate the same way.
Hmm.
And I make it clear that everything that we do is done in the same way and without any kind of bias. There is, no matter how you carve it up, going to be some kind of bias because a decision has to be made,
Yeah.
right? And when a decision is made, that is some kind of bias in some kind of way
Yeah.
because otherwise, no decision is made. That's the only way to exclude some
Yeah.
kind of bias altogether.
Now, I'm curious about how do you choose? You were talking about we just want to present this information and we want to get it out there. How do you choose what format that something belongs in? Because, if you've ever seen a book converted to a movie,
Yeah,
sometimes there's a particular format that did it better, right?
absolutely.
So how do
Yeah.
you pick a format that this needs to be this? For instance, Dover Download is an email newsletter and a podcast, but you also have a TV channel.
Yeah.
So there's all sorts of avenues that you could take something down. How do you choose where to go?
So it depends on what the topic is. If we talk about the budget again for a moment,
Hmm.
that's an example of having to choose multiple platforms to be able to share that information. So we will share information. There's a budget revealed newsletter as well that we also distribute, where we get into the weeds a bit more, really get into the numbers in the budget and break down a lot of the information and trying to break it down in a way that is also digestible. Um, trying to at least help people who maybe don't want to peruse the 850-page budget document. But we can at least give them the numbers, tell them what the numbers are. We're not telling them what they mean, but we can show them where certain things are increasing,
Hmm.
why they're being requested, that kind of thing. And we can really spend some time getting into that, into the details. But we also know that there are people who don't even want that. So we will take that sort of long form approach to distributing information and then carving it up into smaller pieces that maybe will point people back to that if they want it. But we'll create something that's much shorter for social media, for instance,
Hmm.
that will then link to other resources available if they want to learn more. We will send out press releases that maybe focus on a particular workshop in one departmental budget, for instance, that's coming up without really getting into any of the specific details. So it's right now, it's recognizing that there are different audiences for the same topic
Mm.
and having to basically, depending on what the issue is, make sure that we are able to address all of them.
Okay, so it used to be, hey, here's the whole here's the whole turkey, and then, hey, here's just the leg for social media, and here's just the breast for something else.
Right.
You're just kind of distributing out, but now you're kind of realizing there's a need for redundancy in some areas.
Absolutely. Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely there is, because the one thing that has changed, and certainly this is with the advent of social media, is that people are getting information from a variety of different sources. You know, when I think back to my newspaper days, there was a time when people looked to the newspaper and that was about it for the information that they needed. But, some people will go to our website looking for information and they'll hopefully find what they're looking for there. If they're not, then we know we have something to fix. But uh, some people aren't going to look at the website at all. They're going to go straight to social media and see if they can find what they're looking for there. Whether it's on our page or somebody else's page, that's where they're going to go.
Yeah.
Other people are going to tune into Channel 22 and see if they can find what they're looking for there. And some other people are going to maybe still look to the traditional news sources, which is why we also have to make sure that a lot of that information is shared via press releases and that the media is getting that information so that they can also share that information with the public.
Yeah.
So it's maybe more work to have to do that on particular topics, but as a city
Hmm.
that you know that needs to cater to the needs and interests of an entire spectrum of people,
Hmm.
from the youngest of our residents to the oldest of our residents, all of whom have a different way of accessing or finding information. We have to try and make sure we do our best to reach all of them.
It seems like a burden of the democratization that you were talking about earlier. It's like, yes, this is so good. Anybody can produce information and you can connect in so many different ways. It's so easy now. But now you have to kind of like put it out in more places because there are so many different platforms to
Right.
cover. Whereas before it was all monopolized by
Yeah.
newspapers. So,
It was, and I think I give our city manager credit for this too. When he hired me, he made it very clear, and I can talk about this more if you want at some point, but he made it clear to me that transparency and open government were really the number one priorities for him. And the whole reason he was entertaining hiring me, coming from a news background, was that these were things that we were already doing.
hmm,
And he made it very clear to me that, not everything is going to be pretty, but what's most important is that we're sharing that information with the public and
yeah.
making sure that that gets out to the public. And there are still many communities here that don't do it. And that may just be a matter of resources. They don't have a department of media services, or they don't have a public information officer, or they don't have a communications director. They just don't have the resources to be able to share that. So what you end up with are these silos of information that are really sometimes hard to access for the public.
Hmm.
And here, the city manager has been very clear that this is sort of one of our number one goals, is to make sure that we're getting all of this information out to the public and trying to always figure out ways to engage the public and to involve the public, and figure out new ways to reach out. So
Well, how do you measure that? Like, how do you know at the end of the day, hey, we're getting that engagement that we want. We're getting that response that we want. This is working. How do you measure that?
yeah, I mean, there are a variety of ways that we do measure that. I mean, certainly we hear from some people, from some of our residents who say, "Hey, that's great. Thank you. That's helpful." We do get a lot of emails, in particular in response to things that may appear in the newsletters or on Channel 22, and saying thanks. More often than not, though, people aren't going to take the time to say, "Hey, thanks. I enjoyed that." They're just, going to go about their business. If they don't like something, we'll hear about it. So,
I've had that conversation before with someone. It was like people are quite vocal about what they don't appreciate, but it's like the example I gave was you go to a grocery store and the bagger is very pleasant and nice to you, and you go about your day and you don't even think about it because that's normal, that's expected. But if they're rude to you, now you're telling everybody. So just there's something about it's like this doesn't fit right into my life. I need to tell people.
Absolutely. You know, I one of my first jobs was working in retail at this store called Service Merchandise. You probably don't remember that, but they did used to be in the South too. But I remember one of the things that we were told then, and I was still young, I was still in school then, is that it only takes one angry customer to turn off 10 other customers, because once they share that story, there's probably 10 people who aren't going to visit your establishment because they've heard the story, and whether it's true or not or accurate or not, they've already made their minds up that it's just not worth their time.
Yeah.
So I always remember that because we have to, in some ways, this organization is very customer service oriented. It's in our mission statement. So I remember that every time we're putting some of these things together, is that, we do have to pay attention to the things that are going to upset people, because if we don't address that, then we're going to have a bigger problem on our hands,
Mm.
because those kinds of things, whether it's on social media or elsewhere, are going to take on a life of their own. And once people start running with information that is suddenly becomes misinformation, it can become this untamable beast.
Well, what happens is I think there's an erosion of some of the trust, right?
Absolutely.
So if you're, hey, we don't want to talk about that because that could be bad, right? Now you're hiding things, you're
Yeah.
creating that bias
Yeah.
that we were talking about earlier, and people's ability to trust you as a source diminishes. And so now people are looking for, well, I know I can't trust them. I got to find it somewhere.
Yeah.
And that's, you get into those, well, this other person says this is going on. And, I guess I kind of trust them, regardless of how true or false it is. It could be 100% true. It could be 100% false. It doesn't matter. But your trust is evaporated. It's gone now. So people have to find it somewhere else.
And as a governmental entity, if you lose that trust, it can be not only detrimental, it can be, it can be destructive.
Mm, yeah.
Because for a governmental organization, that's really, without trust, you've got nothing.
Yeah.
And this is at a time when there's a lot of mistrust in government, so we are functioning in a time when there's been a real campaign to try and sort of diminish the role of government, whether it's at the local, state, or federal level, and what it is supposed to do. So we know what our mission is, but it's very, very important that we continue that we retain the trust of the people that we serve, because at the end of the day, those are the people who pay our bills,
Yeah.
the taxpayers, and those are the people who we answer to. So we work very hard to make sure that we do everything we can to be a trusted organization, which is in our mission statement. And we make sure that that is sort of above everything else, what we strive for. And it can be tough when we talk about bias. I mean, some people are already starting that conversation with a bias against local government, for
Yeah.
instance, and what its role is or what it does.
Yeah.
So.
And, sometimes people are starting in this position of like, it can just be so difficult and, we'll talk about that later. That's actually one of the questions I have. It can be so difficult to build bridges and connect to that, but we'll talk more about that later. So how did you end up in this role? They had to choose somebody and you were there and you wanted to be chosen, I assume.
Yeah, not to bore you with the details too much, the job as it was originally described was really to address just the PEG access programming side of the city. And when I say PEG, that means public, educational, and governmental access television. So this was at a time when they were trying to figure out a way to better manage the two TV channels that we had.
Mm-hmm.
The position was created. It was called a media services coordinator, and it was really just to oversee that part of the organization. I think it was a day before the position closed. I had reached out to the city manager and said, I might be interested in this. And he said, well, let's talk about it. and we ended up talking about it. He was thrilled, and this is I talked a little bit about this earlier about his focus on and commitment to open government and transparency.
Hmm.
He liked the idea that somebody coming from that background could do some of this, so he sort of redefined the job. Whether that's good or not, I don't know, because it became a much bigger job than it was originally intended to be. Um, but he recrafted that position to encompass everything that we do now. That it was sort of really the public information
Yeah.
office as opposed to just overseeing what's on the TV channels.
Okay.
I did this too at a time when I had I spent nearly 2 decades as a journalist, and it was a hard decision for me to make. But I also had to make a decision about whether if I wanted to stay in journalism, recognizing what was happening to local journalism here, I didn't really have an option. I was going to have to move outside of the community to stay in journalism
Okay.
because the jobs were disappearing in
Mm.
journalism. I was the assistant managing editor at the newspaper when I left, and I said, "Well, I don't want to leave this community. It's the community where I was born and raised,
Mhm.
and I've spent virtually every day here my entire life, except the occasional vacation, which is rare." Uh, and I said, "Well, I don't want to leave." This was an opportunity for me, as I saw it, to essentially do what I was doing for the newspaper, which was communicate to the public what its government is up to.
Yeah.
And I told this to the city manager and I said, look, if that's the way that I can operate this, because, it won't always be pretty, but if you can assure me that I'm able to do that, that I am able to do what I was doing now and make sure that people are informed about what their government is up to, then I'm interested. And he said, absolutely.
All
And
right.
that's how that started.
So the position got rewritten, Mike's job, as opposed to just kind of media
Right.
coordinator. It got rewritten for Mike, and your kind of is just an extension almost of what you were doing. It's just like you migrated over, and somebody different is signing the check now.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's the way I look at it because the staying and working at the local newspaper in the community that I grew up in, that I was born in, for me was a way of giving back to the community. That's the
Mm.
way I saw it.
Okay.
Is helping keep the public informed was for me a way to sort of give back. I was getting a paycheck. I was getting paid, although in the news business you don't get paid a lot. But it was a way to give something back. It was almost
Yeah.
like volunteering, even though you're getting paid
You
for it.
don't get paid money, but your soul gets paid.
Your soul gets paid. Sometimes it gets battered, but occasionally you get paid. So more often than not at the newspaper, you get battered. But well, and that happens here too. But anyhow, it's I saw that as my way of continuing to contribute something to the community and taking this job here with the city. I saw in exactly the same way. I thought, well, here's an opportunity to maybe help better inform this community about what's happening,
Yeah.
um, the good and the bad, but, let's at least inform people about what's going on. There are lots of things that happen here. There are good things that happen here that people don't know about. There are services, there are initiatives, there are all kinds of things. There's a lot going on in local government. And, local government doesn't always do a good job of telling people what it's doing.
Hmm.
And having covered local government for years, I said, well, that's something we're going to address here.
So you were a little bit prepared. It's like I know where the cracks are. I've been trying to do this from the outside for years,
Yeah.
and now you're on the inside, and you can fill those cracks and those gaps that were
Yeah.
probably pain points during your career.
Some of them certainly were. But I will say this, one of the reasons that I was willing to also sort of cross over, some would say to the dark side, but to cross over to local government was that I had covered Dover, both as a reporter and as an editor. And I felt strongly that there was, especially under the current administration, a real commitment to open government. And despite some of the problems that we'd had in the past with Dover on as a journalist, I knew that all of that was something that I could, it wasn't going to be an issue for me.
Yeah.
I was confident in how the city was being managed that it wasn't going to be a problem, and that made it easier for me to join the city as a government employee
Mm.
as opposed to a journalist. So, had it been another community that was making that offer, I probably wouldn't have done it.
So the fact that it was Dover really is what sold you.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. But that's not to say that I didn't have my problems as a journalist. I mean, the city manager to this day will still, you know, in his own way, will still needle me sometimes about some of the editorials that I wrote or uh, some of the articles that appeared in the paper,
Yeah.
particularly at a weekly I worked at. So he reminds me that, I would get under his skin sometimes with some of these things, but that's good.
Yeah.
So
Well, let's talk about you. You used to work at Foster's Daily Democrat, right? That's the one that's right next to City Hall, the building right there.
it's an apartment building now.
Okay.
So the newspaper sadly has no physical structure in this city anymore.
Okay. So it's
Uh,
only online.
their office, there is an office in Portsmouth. The company that ended up buying Foster's Daily Democrat, which happened shortly after I left. Uh, we can talk some more about that after but that's another reason why I left.
Yeah.
They continue to sort of shrink the operation, the news operation. So, I mean, as an example, when I left the newspaper, we had I was the assistant managing editor, but we had an executive editor, we had a managing editor, we had copy editors, we had 6 of those. We had 5 reporters covering Dover, we had 4 reporters covering Portsmouth, we had 4 in Rochester, we had 2 in Somersworth, we had 1 in Exeter, we had 1 in York, we had staff photographers. Today, Foster's has 1 reporter who is covering essentially the entire territory that all those reporters covered just, some 10, 11, 12 years ago. The news industry changed dramatically,
Yeah.
obviously. So that makes it a bit of a challenge too, where they have one person covering what maybe 20 people covered.
Yeah.
So
Man.
it puts us in an interesting position too as a city because we distribute a lot of press releases to the media. And sometimes that's the only way the media is going to get that information because they don't have reporters out there actually covering all of these stories. And I think that's a problem. I mean, because as much as it's important that we're able to get that information out to the media and to the public, there is an important role that local journalism plays that once gone cannot be replaced. And they serve as a watchdog and an important one at that. And without that, without that kind of oversight, governments can get lazy. And and I have said this, we have to make sure that we are not getting lazy because we don't have, reporters knocking on our doors every single day asking, what about this? What about that? What about this? So we have a responsibility to get that information out, but we also have a responsibility not to be lazy about it.
Yeah.
And make sure that and my staff here, we will have conversations about, well, what would the newspaper potentially be writing about this or want to know about this, and how can we get that information out there?
Yeah.
That was a bit of a tangent, I think, to your question, but
No, it's fine. I did want to talk to you, obviously about kind of like what was it like working there, which you described, but I did eventually want to talk to you also about the value and the benefit of local media to a community, which you just covered very well. Um, one thing I kind of want to add on to what you said, you say that it's a watchdog to government, and without it, government can get lazy. One of the things that I feel like is a little bit true, especially with government, is it's not even just government. It can happen anywhere. It's corruption can grow where accountability can't reach. So give anyone a job and then take away the accountability for that job, and this person will stop doing the job to the standards that are required. That's true anywhere. And so what you're describing is y'all were keeping that visibility and that spotlight turned on to make sure that accountability could reach into government.
Absolutely. It's important that we do that. One thing that can be a little bit more difficult in local government is it only takes one bad actor anywhere in local government. Doesn't necessarily have to be here. Something happens somewhere in another community, and suddenly it paints a picture for everybody about how local government operates. Some people already have their minds made up about how government functions, and a lot of that is based on what they may remember about how government operated 50 years ago, and where you certainly would see some corruption, not so much in local government as you might at the state or federal level, but that's sort of, the context for a lot of people about government. And that, I still hear from people who think that that's just sort of the default for government, that it's all about who and favors and and corruption, and greasy palms, and has not been like that for a while. There are a lot more safeguards in place, but despite that, it's an uphill battle to make sure that we are not being perceived in that light.
Yeah.
Perception is, a big. We recognize that perception is, sort of 90% of that battle. If people perceive us to be something, even if it's something that we're not, then, a decision is made and suddenly we're being, cast in a different light.
I guess it goes back to that, what we were talking about earlier with trust, is somewhere along the way, public lost trust and you're having to rebuild it.
Absolutely. Which is why it is really critical, and not only for us, but I think it's critical for any level of government, but certainly local government, is to, by default, be transparent. Mm-hmm. Your first thought should be, how do we get this information out, not how do we bury this information?
Yeah.
It should always be, how do we make sure that we can get this out to people so that they can find it?
Yeah.
And that, sadly, not everybody functions that way, but that is sort of one of our paramount. I mean, that is paramount here. So,
yeah. And, to be honest with you, that's a little bit part of the reason why I started the podcast, is because I wanted to help people build, because communities are built on trust, right? You can't have a relationship with somebody if you can't trust them. So to create stronger communities, you have to build trust with it. And that's kind of one of the motivating things with this podcast, is talk to people, get to know how government works, get to know what people are doing, and, just start having those conversations and start revealing that, I guess, trust that you can have.
Well, one of the reasons that I'm happy to be on your podcast is because I believe that more people should be doing exactly what you're doing. Podcast is certainly a great way to do this, but there are other ways that people can also be involved and stay engaged and try to get and find and try to just be informed about how their local government works. Mm-hmm. So this podcast is a great example of actually just getting out there and doing it, and meeting with people and talking about it, the good and the bad, but here's how it works, and building that trust. Because the trust works both ways. It has to. It's not only, trusting your government, but it's trusting one another.
Yeah.
And if you have a community that is built on trust, then everything sort of functions a little bit better, mm-hmm. because you don't have to worry about that.
Yeah.
And so
you're not constantly looking over your shoulder, worried about what your neighbor's going to do to you,
right?
What your government's going to do to you and stuff like that,
Yeah. And it's very easy for somebody to paint a picture of the evil government doing just that. And if they're not responding, or if their actions aren't, dispelling that, then that story just sort of takes off on its own.
And to be fair to the people who have that distrust, sometimes governments are untrustworthy. It happens. Yep. It's very unfortunate when that happens, especially in a democratic processed republic like we have. It's sad when that happens, but the value of the democratic process is that it allows for overcoming that. So,
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think you'll find from the city manager on down, and our city council feels the same way. They are very proactive when it comes to trying to encourage people to stay involved and be involved. They want to hear from everybody,
yeah.
the good and the bad. And we are always looking for ways to make sure that people are trying to at least. We want communication to be two ways, right? So, I mean, we want to be able to hear from people and we want to be able to talk to people. We don't want to be sort of in these silos where, unfortunately, some governments, organizations sort of function in a silo
Yeah.
or in a vacuum.
Yeah, where they're making decisions by themselves that affect everybody
Yep.
else and stuff. So, we've talked about how you support the community. How can the community support local media? We've talked about the importance of it. How can people help?
And when you say local media, you're talking about the newspaper, for instance,
Sure,
or media. Yeah.
just local media in general. How can people support the initiative
Yeah.
of local media? We've talked about the value of it, the benefit of it. How can people support it to help keep all those benefits going?
I think first and foremost, and you just said it in a different way, is you have to recognize the value of local media. When I was at the newspaper, one of the things that we would always say to people is, look, there you can get your news about what's happening at federal government with the federal government. You can get your international news from a variety of sources. You can get your state news even in a number of places. Your local news, which is where everything is happening, those are the decisions that have the most direct effect on people. The decisions that are made by their local government have the most direct effect on their lives. And most people don't even know that. Or they may know it, but they don't really stay informed to the point where they recognize it.
Yeah.
Local media has a really important role to play in that. It's really kind of a critical role that once gone means that layer of accountability disappears. And the decisions that are being made that have the greatest effect on the people who live in that community are suddenly not being made in a way that they're not getting the attention that it's not getting the attention it deserves. If you don't recognize the value of how local media helps sort of keep your community accountable, then it's at risk of disappearing. And once it disappears, then there's not really much else to replace it except social media and opinions. And, it gets really, really messy. So newspapers struggled for a long time because they couldn't, they sat on their hands and rested on their laurels for far too long, thinking that nothing was really going to topple newspapers as an outlet. Then, classified advertising disappeared, and then advertising disappeared, and then the internet came along, and suddenly there was an expectation that everything was going to be free. And information, of course, should always be free, but producing producing news as a news organization is not cheap. And if the expectation is that all of that is going to be done for free, you're going to get what you pay for when it comes to local news. And that's why we don't have much local news anymore. So there's an expectation that everything is for free. So I would say, support local media where you can, because more than anything else, more than your national outlets and your international outlets, if you want to make sure that there is a layer of accountability in your community, but also an informational pipeline to even the simple things like who's having a bake sale, or who's what your local sports team is doing.
Yeah, it doesn't have to just always be government
No
focus. It could be just focused on like the farmer's market or
Absolutely.
local grown food and restaurants. It could be about anything, just as long as you're focusing it on local, on your community. Highlight those things that are around you.
Absolutely.
Hmm.
Yep. And
Yeah.
sadly though, once it's gone, and we've seen this happen across the country, once we've seen hundreds of newspapers disappear in local communities, there's nothing to replace them. Nothing other than social media fills
Yeah.
that void. And then you're down that tricky and dangerous road where you don't know.
We need more
If
podcasts.
we need more podcasts. I agree. No, I mean, we and you have obviously been on the podcast,
Hmm.
which was great. I think recognize we had a conversation about this is that podcasts play today a really important role in the free distribution of information.
Hmm.
It has opened up the ability for a lot of people to share information. I mean, not all of it's good, not all of it's pleasant, but it doesn't matter
Yeah.
because you know what? People should have the ability to share that information
Yeah.
and to tell their story
Hmm.
without the barriers of, expensive equipment or, you know, uh, without
Distribution.
distribution or commercial
Yeah.
interests, who
Yeah.
are always going to sort of dictate what is and what isn't appropriate.
Yeah. Lowering the cost of distribution is really huge. Yeah, for sure. So, in your time, you've done all this, you've been acquiring skills and you've learned how to do obviously stuff for television and podcast and all other sorts of different media. How did you learn to do all of this? Where did you get these skills from?
So I actually I started out as a filmmaker. I was making films,
Okay.
movies when I was 9 years old. Really, I mean, I started. That's that.
Anything I might have seen at a theater?
I hope not. No, I think most of that has been destroyed. Most of those early films. So thankfully, so the world won't be subjected to that.
Oh, man.
Um, but that was where I had started. So my background originally was film, but I also started. I was also writing. So I was a fiction writer, and I had started selling fiction fairly early on. So I was sort of working on both those tracks where I enjoyed writing and I also enjoyed filmmaking. And by the time I ended up at the newspaper, I had gone to college for English, as it
Hmm.
turns out, but I was still working in film and film production at the time and continued to do that and still do to this day. Um, so that was really sort of just a matter of course for me because I had done both of those things from a pretty young age. So the film and video production side of things I was comfortable with. The writing and news, for instance, were things I was comfortable with. That was, I think, part of the reason too that I was hired for the job because I had experience sort of on both sides of the what this operation entails or what it would become.
Hmm.
Um, is there's some of it that's very technically involved on the video or TV production side of things here, and then there are lots of other things that really require sort of what a writer or a reporter or an editor would do, which is very different than what we do on the TV side of things. So these were things that I was doing from a very young age, and I mean, I guess I'm fortunate that I couldn't figure out exactly what I wanted to do and ended up doing both of them,
Yeah.
because it sort of served me well. Other than the fact that it ended up creating a job that which was much bigger than it was intended to be, but
Is the paycheck much bigger than it was intended to be?
well, it's bigger than it was at least in journalism. But yeah, I think it's fair to say that you don't work in government or journalism for the money.
Hmm.
So
I used to volunteer at a zoo, and the people who worked at the zoo said the same thing. They do it for the love of the
yeah,
animals. Yeah.
yeah.
So when you are not producing all this media and everything, you've lived here your whole life. What do you like to do around town
Well, in my free time, when I
when you
find
have
it,
that?
yeah, when I find it, I be what I love about living here, and I hope you'll learn to appreciate this too, is that we are surrounded by just about everything you could possibly want. I mean, we have 4 full seasons,
Hmm.
between fall and spring and summer, especially, we get to see it all. So we've got the complete range there. Some people might not like the snow and the cold, but, it does pass.
Hmm.
Um, but we've got the mountains and we've got the ocean and we've got Portland that's an hour north of here and we've got Boston that's an hour south of here. We've got just about anything you could possibly want here. So we certainly like to hike the trails around here.
Hmm.
Mountain biking is something that I like to do and find new trails, which is another thing that I really enjoy with our community trail effort here and seeing that continue to expand. The hiking in the mountains is really something that is also in its own way relaxing.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
love to do that. Um, but I also like to just explore. I have a real passion for this city's history. I've always been involved in to some degree in communicating the city's history. I was for years the vice president of the when we had a historical society here. This was about probably 15 years ago. I joined because there was an attempt to try and get younger people involved and interested in history. And that was what my role was supposed to be. But that didn't work out all that well. The Historical Society is now defunct. And, it can sometimes be a challenge getting people interested in history. But in my spare time, I also manage something called Made in Dover. So it has a social media presence and there's a lot of video, most of which is focused on the city's history. So these are sort of magazine style pieces on various aspects of the city's history. I enjoy doing that because it's a way for me to sort of share a lot of the city's interesting either or lesser known or even sometimes odd history
Yeah.
of this city, which is, as you
How to
prob-
scratch that history itch.
yeah, and we're of course celebrating our 400th anniversary this year in 2023 as the
Hmm.
first permanent settlement in New Hampshire. Um,
Shots
First
fired.
permanent European settlement,
Yeah.
because one of the things that we're trying to do here too is recognize that the colonists were here in 1623, but there were lots of other people here before that. So
Yeah. So we're down to the last two questions here, which I ask of every guest. And our theme for the season is about resolving disagreements, building bridges. What are some ways that people, neighbors, you know, people on social media can create bridges and resolve disagreements with each other? What are some strategies that you can use for that?
I think one of the things that's worked well for us is making sure that everybody has a seat at the table and a way to talk to one another. One of the things that in this age of social media that is lost is the actual social aspect of it. Social media is a bit of a oxymoron because people aren't all that social on social media, and it really just sort of becomes a megaphone for whatever it is that you want to scream at the top of your lungs, and then walk away and hide behind a keyboard. What has worked well, I think, is making sure that we give the public an opportunity when we talk about building bridges to meet face to face, whether this be a neighborhood meeting or whether this be in other kinds of forms where people are invited to just sort of show up and talk about the things that are important to them,
Hmm.
and they're going to be listened to, and hopefully going to learn something. But you may find that this city has more boards and commissions than almost any other community in the state. I think we have some 40 some odd boards, committees, and commissions right now. That indicates that you have a very engaged public because it's very hard to find volunteers to fill all these seats on these various boards. But,
Hmm.
other than a few vacancies right now, they're all full. part of the reason that that's happening is because people do want to be involved, and they recognize that this is a welcoming community when it comes to your opinion
Mm.
and your thoughts and your ideas. And if people feel like they're not able to share those, then they will turn to social media and they will start to tell their own story and their
Yeah.
own narrative about what isn't working.
Mm.
So we have found that through a number of these other initiatives, but these community meetings, these neighborhood meetings, we'll occasionally hold these sessions at the Strand Theater here, which will pack the theater and just give people an opportunity to ask questions and have various people there to answer questions. That I think means that people have an opportunity to talk face to face. I think when people do talk face to face, it diffuses a lot of the biases we may have
Yeah.
that are easy to amplify on social media. But when you're talking to somebody face to face, and I've had this has happened to me. I mean, some of the most vocal critics of the city, when seated next to you and talking to you face to face, are a completely different person.
They immediately transition over into like, oh, well, I have to interact with this person and let's be more respectful.
Yeah. Not everybody, but most people I think are, I mean, and I think people value, whether they even know that they do, they value the idea of being able to talk to somebody face to face in
Yeah.
person. And I think that's really, really important for us to be able to foster
Mm.
here. So we do that however we can and whenever we can, but also making sure that communication is two ways, so that people do know that they're going to be heard and that there's going to be a response.
Yeah.
That is really important, to build these bridges. So, I mean, we are not a municipal building surrounded by a moat.
Yeah.
So,
Come on in.
yeah,
So make people feel welcome and meet them in person.
meet them in person. Yeah.
All right. What do you think the city of Dover should focus on next?
The city should focus on, I think, what it is already focusing on, which is where we're headed from here. Dover is the fastest growing city in the state. With that kind of growth comes a lot of, concerns, but also challenges.
Hmm.
And I think knowing that we are growing as fast as we're growing, and knowing that we don't want to make some of the mistakes that other communities that have either allowed themselves to grow too fast or didn't know how to address that growth in a responsible way, sort of helps guide us into that future, which is really sort of happening very quickly. As somebody who's been here my entire life, I've seen some pretty dramatic change.
Hmm.
But I've also seen a city that has really sort of planned for the future responsibly. I won't name names for some other communities that haven't quite done that, but managing growth in a responsible way is really going to be really important for the next 10, 20, and 25, 30 years here in Dover. And I think we have, between our planning department, which I think does a really good job of sort of with our master plan, and we're going through a visioning process right now. We do this about every 10 years. There's a vision chapter of the master plan
Hmm.
where we try to think about what the future is going to look like and how to actually start to prepare for that now, so that we can, by the time it comes, be responsible and smart about what is inevitable here, and that is the continued growth.
All right. Well, is there anything else that you would like to add before we close out?
No, I just want to thank you for having me on the podcast. I think as I said, I really think this is a great podcast and idea, and I want to see you obviously to keep doing it. I'm happy that you're doing this new season on
Yeah.
next season on Dover, but I want to continue to see your episodes in the future in other communities,
Awesome. Well,
hopefully in New Hampshire. But
yeah, yeah. Well, thank you very much for coming onto the show, Mike. And thank you for listening to the Your City podcast. I hope you enjoyed our talk today with Mike. If you enjoyed the show, you can help us out by sharing it with somebody else that you think might enjoy it. It could be friend, family member, coworker, someone that you think would enjoy this type of content. We don't have a big advertising budget. It's mostly just me doing everything, and I don't even like social media, so it's a big struggle for me to do this type of stuff. So any word of mouth that you can give us is greatly appreciated. Thank you so much, and we'll catch you on the next one.